It's funny when I get introduced and someone mentions the proximity of love and violence and how marriage can kill you or save your life. It's always funny to me that people start to laugh, which makes me feel like I was onto something. I'll just read the first page and a half of the novel, which needs no introduction, and then I thought I'd talk a little about how this book started and came to be written. It's mildly interesting. When David Pepin first dreamed of killing his wife, he didn't kill her himself. He dreamed convenient acts of God. At a picnic on the beach, a storm front moved in. David and Alice collected their chairs, blankets, and booze. And when the lightning flashed, David imagined his wife lit up, her skeleton distinctly visible as in a children's cartoon, Alice then collapsing into a smoking pile of ash. He watched her walk quickly across the sand, the tallest object in the wide open space. She even stopped to observe the piling clouds. Some storm, she said. He tempted fate by hubris. In his mind, he declared, I, David Pepin, am wiser and more knowing than God, and I, David Pepin, know that God shall not, at this very moment, on this very beach, Jones Beach, strike my wife down. God did not. David knew more. And in their van, when the rain came so densely, it seemed they were in a car wash. He boasted of his godliness to Alice, asked rhetorically if a penis this large and this erect, thus exposed, could be anything but divine. And he made love to his wife angrily and passionately, right in the front seat, hidden by the heavy weather. He dreamed unconsciously, and he dreamed sporadically. His fantasies simply welled up. If she called from work, he asked, did something happen? If she was late coming home, he began to worry too soon. He began to dream according to her schedule. Taking the train today, David asked in the morning. Taking the train, Alice said. It was a block west to Lexington, where she'd pick up the subway down to 42nd Street. At Grand Central, she'd take Metro North 30 minutes to Hawthorne, where they taught emotionally disturbed and occasionally dangerous children. Anything could happen between here and there. On the edge of the platform, two boys were roughhousing. The train came barreling into the station. An accidental push. Alice spun around, did a crazy backstroke before she fell, and it was over. David winced. The things that went through his mind. From their window, he watched Alice walk up the street. A helicopter passed overhead. On Lexington, at the building under construction, a single girder was winched into the sky. And David imagined this was the last time he would ever see his wife, that this was the last image he had of her, and he felt the sadness well up. He had the smallest taste of his loss, like the wish when you are young that your parents would die. First question people always ask me is, what does your wife think of the book? I get it every time, and so I just preempt it. Because my wife and I started calling it popping the question. We got it everywhere. In fact, funny story, before I go into process, my wife came with me on tour this past summer, and we were in Oxford, Mississippi, and I read this long, very sexy, smutty section full of sex and bloody death. And I get the questions, blah, blah, this, blah, and someone says, what does your wife think of the book? And I said, well, why don't you ask her herself? She's right there. And I'm biased, but my wife is, she's a beautiful, lovely lady, which completely infuriated the questioner. How could such a pretty, smart-looking woman be with such a person? And my wife said, well, you know, marriage is a mixed bag. Which this lady hated the answer. She was like, you can't be so understanding. That's just not fair. I started Mr. Peanut in 1995. The book, all told, while working full-time, took about 12 years to write. It was a very long process, but it started with a bang. And for all aspiring writers in the room, I would say this, you ignore inspiration at your own peril. Because it was a very inspired beginning. In 1995, my wife and I were living out in Long Island. I had finished with grad school in St. Louis, and she was about to start law school in Nashville. And maybe because I am a native New Yorker, murder was on my mind because she was moving us down to Nashville. But my father got this phone call, and he looked ashen after the phone call. And I'm really close with my dad. And I said, well, what's wrong? And he said, well, your cousin died. Well, my cousin, who she'd had a really tough life. She had a terrible thyroid condition. She was morbidly obese. She had struggled all her life with acute depression. She had lethal nut allergies. And according to her husband, who was conveniently the only witness to her suicide, he claimed that he came home. She was sitting at their kitchen table with a plate of peanuts in front of her. They got into an argument, and at the climax of the argument, she grabbed a handful of peanuts and ate them and died of anaphylaxis right in front of him. She had also conveniently hidden her EpiPens. Well, when I heard this story, I was thunderstruck. I'd studied Hitchcock intensively, where I did my first master's at Hollins. I was obsessed with Hitchcock. And I thought I just heard about The Perfect Murder, because the wife ate the evidence. I sat down and in a single sitting wrote the first 3 chapters of Mr. Peanut, with really very few substantial differences, with very few substantial modifications. And then suddenly things kind of ground to a halt. I had written myself into something I didn't understand yet. But what I do want you to remember, just for the purpose of this short talk, is the name. I mean, the first line came to me. When David Pepin first dreamed of killing his wife, he didn't kill her himself. He dreamed convenient acts of God. And so did the last line of the book. Well, several things happened along this sort of 12-year process that I'll tell you about. Some of them may be more interesting than others. But to give you a little bit of backstory, Mr. Peanut is a story about a man, David Pepin, who may or may not have killed his wife. And she's died under these very suspicious circumstances. He's being interrogated by 2 detectives, Detective Ward Hastrell, and Detective Sam Shepard. And looking around the room, I see people for whom the Sam Shepard murder case was the crime of the century. Well, when I initially started Mr. Peanut, what did I want to do? I wanted to write a novel wherein the 2 detectives interrogating the suspect began to see aspects of their own relationships, their own marriages during the interrogation. Marriage, of course, being the great spectator sport, right? Think about it. I mean, there is nothing we love to do more than tell stories about other people's marriages. We go to dinner parties and we meet complete strangers who are married. You've been in this situation where you meet this couple who, from cocktails through dessert, are just giving it to each other. They're just merciless with each other. And you get in your car and you go home with your beloved, and your wife says to you, "Oh, sweetie, let's never get like that." And that's the amazingly dynamic thing about marriage, which is that bingo, 5 years later, you may be. Not to mention the fact that everyone else's marriage from the outside seems completely comprehensible. It's like, the way he treats her, and if he treated her differently, they'd be so happy, We think we know, but we don't know about ourselves. And so I wanted to write about that. But after this initial burst of inspiration, I was kind of stuck. Well, the next thing that happened, I had another very fortuitous conversation with my dad. Because initially I had these two detectives. One detective thought every suspect he interrogated was innocent, and the other detective thought every suspect he interrogated was guilty. And that was too didactic. It wasn't working. I didn't know exactly why it wasn't working. Again, for aspiring writers in the room, if you keep coming to the page and something's not working and you can't work, pay attention. Because your guts are telling you something. Well, my dad's a career actor, and he told me about the famous Fugitive television series. We were watching the remake. And he said, it's based on a true story. I said, really? And he told me about the Dr. Sam Shepard case. So I went and started reading about the Dr. Sam Shepard murder case. And bingo, I felt like I'd stumbled onto a gold mine. And those of you who know anything about it, just for the people in the audience who don't remember it as well, Dr. Sam Shepard, this very successful young osteopath from a family of osteopaths living in Bay Village, Ohio, on the night of July 4th, may or may not have killed his wife. She was 4 months pregnant with their second child. They were high school sweethearts. And in the middle of the night, he claimed that an intruder came in, beat her head in. He fought with this intruder down on the beach of Lake Erie and was once again overcome after being knocked unconscious the first time. And then his life was sucked down a wormhole. Within 3 months, he was tried and convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to 10 years in an Ohio penitentiary. During the trial, his mother shot herself. His father died of stomach cancer. He did not have any access to see his son ship, and his wife had, of course, been killed. Shepard served 10 years in Ohio State Penitentiary until a young, up-and-coming attorney in his early 20s by the name of F. Lee Bailey argued his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and got it thrown out on grounds of the fact that Shepard's constitutional right for a fair trial was denied. So the state of Ohio retried him. And he was found not guilty. So in Sam Shepard, I had the perfect gray night of marriage because he was the only man that I can tell was actually convicted and exonerated of killing his wife. Right? So that was explosion number 2. And then explosion number 3 was the design of the book. The book is designed like a gigantic Mobius band. Now, some of you may not be able to define what a Mobius band is, but you see them everywhere. You probably see them in trash receptacles all around the library, because the Mobius band is the universal symbol for recycling and sustainability. It's a non-orientable surface with one side and one edge. Where you all have really seen them is in M.C. Escher's work. For instance, ants on a Mobius strip, where you'll see a pair of ants that are, one looks like it's walking on the ceiling of the other ant's floor. Do you know what I'm talking about? And they loop around. And if you trace your finger along the Mobius band, you find that even though it looks like there are two sides, they're actually just one side. Well, this to me was a perfect metaphor for marriage. Why? Because when you are married, even though you agree to wed yourselves to the same side of life, boy, oh boy, there ain't nothing worse than it seems like you're on opposite sides. And yet you go round and round and round the same problems. So there's a character in the novel, Mr. Mobius, who is either a PI or a hitman who, in a very kind of Bruno Anthony moment a la Hitchcock Strangers on a Train, very subtly invites the opportunity to kill the main character's wife, if that's possibly what he's looking to do. And so the book constantly loops around some of these themes. The way we're on opposite sides, the way we go round and round certain problems, and yet also, even more importantly and hopefully, the way in marriage we cycle into periods of redemption and rediscovery. I like to say, people say to me, are you happily married? And I like to say I'm successfully married. Because on Tuesday, I was not happily married. Thursday was great. But Mr. Peanut is really a murder mystery about the way in which we feel awfully responsible for each other's happiness in marriage. And I think that when Stephen King said the book gave him nightmares, I've always taken that as a very high compliment, because I think that as a guy who's been married 16 years, I know that there is nothing worse than being lonely in marriage. And that's what I wanted to write about. And to me, the real mystery of the book, the MacGuffin of the book is, did David kill Alice? But the really more wondrous mystery about marriage that the book explores is, how do we get from there to here? It's an amazing thing. If we survive marriage, and I don't mean survive in the sense like you're out in the Australian outback with no water, survive. I mean, how do we grow together? Especially in this day and age where so many forces force us to grow apart or at different paces. And so that's what Mr. Peanut's about. And on that happy note, I'll turn it over to Bat.
Questions, please. I don't know if you can ask Adam who done it or how it happened, or he won't give away the punchline. You've got to buy the book first. Any questions?
This is for Adam.
Yes, ma'am.
What happened to your cousin's husband, if anything?
The question was, what happened to my cousin's husband? He approached my great uncle, who was a very successful builder in Los Angeles, for some money. And my great uncle said, much less pleasantly, no. And the guy disappeared into the woodwork. I mean, it was very obvious that he killed her. And so, I mean, I really like what Bat said about, continuity of souls. I mean, just in the same way in Mr. Peanut, I felt very compelled as I was researching the Shepard case not to resolve the question of who killed Marilyn Shepard, or on a macro level, who killed Alice Pepin. I think it was only respectful not to resolve it, because the book is about failure and redemption in marriage. And so that's really, couple to couple, the great mystery, how to succeed. Yes? Yes, ma'am?
What are each of you reading now?
I am doing some research on a second book, and the funny thing about writing historical fiction, which this next one will be as well, it's kind of the journalist thing. I get to go back and I get to play with history and tease out different parts of it. One of the characters in this next book is going to be modeled after, it's set in World War II, the marvelous war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who was just a brilliant, brilliant man, and one of his dispatches is one of the most brilliant pieces of war journalism I've ever read, and it still gives me chills and tears every time I read it. So I've been reading Ernie Pyle lately.
I am about to go to Perth, Australia for the Perth Writers Festival. And so I'm reading The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes, which is about the founding of the Australian penal colony. And I can only tell you all, if you haven't read it, it is, it's amazing. I mean, it just is, because it's about basically at the end of the 18th century, it's about the attempt by Imperial England to create a dystopia tens of thousands of miles away by taking their whole criminal class and shipping them to the other side of the world. And read it. It's unbelievable. I'm reading lots of other things too, but that's something. Yes, ma'am?
I've heard a lot today about 12 years for the first novel, and a lot of these are parents, children, and full-time workers or whatever. How do you structure your time? I mean, like, you do little spurts and then go on, or did you have wide spots that nothing was written, or steadily plugging? I mean,
Massive amounts of amphetamines. No, I mean, you know, I think Joyce Carol Oates said that one of the most necessary characteristics a writer needs is energy. And I'm a real morning guy. I'm a disgusting morning person. I mean, I get up very early, sometimes 4:30. And that's when the freshest hours of my day are those first 3 hours. When I'm really cooking and I have the time, it's 3 hours, some kind of break, 2 hours. But you have to have this, I'm a big believer in routine, you have to have this protected space and time. And it's really smart to stop when you're absolutely kicking it, so that the next day you pick up there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good. My structure, for this book, it was a little bit different, I think. I had just left New York, and I was a senior broadcast producer, which meant putting the show on, and the editorial direction and decisions were largely mine. So, I had a show that went on at the same time every day, and there are no excuses. I had a staff of writers and tape producers and correspondents. I don't know how many times they heard me say, what part about we go on the air in 3 minutes don't you understand in terms of getting me script? And this book was written, I actually wrote it in about 5 months while I was still working a full-time job, just because I think I still had that discipline of schedule and shut up and write. And that's pretty much the attitude I took. Now, I was on a panel once with a young woman, a lovely and talented woman by the name of Heidi Giroux, who was asked that question, and I think Heidi said it took her 10 years to write her book, her novel. And then the question came to me, and I said, well, I wrote mine essentially in 5 months. She actually kicked me under the table and leaned over and said, I hate you. Of course, as justice is a rather circular thing, Heidi's book is, I think, number 10 or 12 on the New York Times list, and mine's not.
Sir? Oh, sorry.
That I remember reading about Ernie Todd walking on the beach, and a small Bible apparently belonged to one of the soldiers. I remember reading that.
Yes.
He picked the Bible up, and he looked at it and he put it back down. And then later he wrote he didn't know why he picked it up, and he didn't know why he put it back down.
Yeah, that I remember that exact story. The one I think I was referring to was I think it's titled "The Death of Captain Winslow," I believe was the captain's last name. And I would recommend any of you to look that one up. And I defy any one of you to read it and email me and say you didn't have a tear in your eye at the end of that one. Yes, ma'am.
Dad, I wanted to just say that I applaud your efforts to get your character
pardoned. What is it about the pardon and parole board in your state that might make this happen in the future when it didn't succeed this time? I don't know that much about that system.
The only thing I can say about that, and I'm not defaming my state too much, the fact that in the course of a century they couldn't see things a little bit differently. The process with the pardon and parole board is a pardon is always weighed, or parole is weighed heavily on the request or a letter of any surviving victim's family members, and I think that is what had a lot to do with this, and I can't argue with that. That's part of the process. I mean, this board had 6 people on it. I need 5 out of 6 votes to get it. And we'll try again, see what happens.
Adam, I have a question for you. 2-part question.
Oh, yes.
After 12 years with the same characters, were you just not tired of them by the time you published the book? And do you think that Sam Shepard was guilty?
Did everyone hear the question? Second question first. Like marriage, it depends on the day. I mean, there are days when there are so many holes in Shepard's testimony. And for those of you who, again, may not know much about the Shepard case, or if you knew about the Shepard case by way of The Fugitive, in The Fugitive, the Dr. Richard Kimball character is a white knight of marriage. Well, in fact, Dr. Sam Shepard was a bad guy. He was a serial philanderer. He carried on these affairs very much out in the open, as if, in a kind of game of marital brinksmanship, he was daring Marilyn to divorce him. Because Shepard's father, who was a very imperious guy, wouldn't grant him a divorce. And Shepard had an ongoing 3-year affair with Susan Hayes, a lab tech, a pathologist essentially, that he broke off mere months before he killed Marilyn, conveniently. On the other hand, there is a very suspicious character, Richard Eberling, who looked shockingly like Shepard, who not only had forensic evidence at the crime scene, but also had stolen Marilyn Shepard's wedding ring. And when he was brought in by police several years later, who questioned him about many petty thefts around Bay Village, Ohio, they said, "You know why you're here, don't you?" And Eberling said, "Look, I bled all over the Shepard house because I cut my finger that day while I was cleaning and just bled all over the room." They're like, "That's actually not why you're here." But in the tradition of Bat's parole board, they said, "Okay, well, you can go." Anyway, so
Was that in the state of South Carolina?
as for 12 years, I mean, for me, writing Mr. Peanut is a series of intertwined narratives, and discovering the novel's structure was such an organic process that figuring out how to bind these different parts was, for me, an enduring challenge. And back to the earlier question, I was regularly interrupted. I was a journalist for years. And there's nothing like writing after doing some writing. And then I was a teacher. And God bless all the teachers of the world. Because I can just tell you that during the school year, I didn't get a lot of writing done. So the struggle for time was Herculean. So no, I didn't get bored because there was a lot to do and very little time to do it.
Yes.
This is for Adam. You mentioned just then all the different plots and stories in Mr. Peanut. And I was just wondering, did you write it from beginning to end? Did you write different parts of it and then
I wrote, the question was, did I write Mr. Peanut in sequence? The answer is no. One of my heroes is Vladimir Nabokov, the Russian writer. Y'all may know him. His working method was he'd write his novels on index cards, and he had a shoebox. And he'd get inspired and he'd write a passage and he'd say, oh, that's sort of in the middle. And he'd put that scene in the middle of the shoebox. And then he'd say, oh, that's kind of the end. And he'd put it at the end. And so on. And then at the end, he would take out the index cards and write the connecting tissue. And so he'd rewrite the whole novel straight through. I really wrote it out of sequence. And again, this character appears throughout the novel, this Mobius character, who may or may not have killed the woman, Alice Pepin. And he became sort of the binding force of these disparate elements. And in the last year of drafting, I was made writer-in-residence of the school where I taught, and I had this huge whiteboard, and I had, you would have thought I was in business, because I had unbelievable outlines that I sort of consulted and figured out. So.
I just wanted to tell you, Adam, I thought you did such a great job from Alice's point of view.
Oh, thank you.
Because when I kept reading it, it said, I can't believe a man can write this and think what's in a woman's head. Kept looking back at your picture.
Thank you very much. I mean, honestly, writing actually the parts of the novel I'm proudest of are when Marilyn Shepard takes over the novel, and I personally, my book of short stories, which comes out this summer, the last story is from a woman's point of view, and I find it very liberating. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, so bios that we had covered from when you were at Legacy, right?
CBS.
CBS. One of the B's.
It's all the same.
That you covered 9/11. Is it? Are you too close to it? Is it too soon? Is there not a nugget from that? I'm not even trying to ask this question. It's like, how do you write about that? Do you really need the perspective of time to do that? Just for yourself.
That's pretty interesting, and I'll give you kind of a short version of that. Be happy to talk more about it afterwards. But it was my broadcast that was on air that morning. So I started the coverage of for CBS that day, and during the course of those first hours, I think that all of us were like. And certainly soldiers in combat is not a great metaphor because they face real death. But at that point, we went into a professional mode. We simply tried to get information on air. We tried to figure out what was going on as it was going on. And I don't think any of us stopped to think for a certain amount of time what was really going on. I had no real sense of it until I walked out of the building very late that day and saw a man with an automatic weapon on the streets of New York, which I had never seen and thought would never happen in America. And that is when it began to fizz on me. In terms of my own perspective, yeah, there's still stuff that I've probably got, we tend to do that, bottled up. But yes, I think that, yes, I'd like to go back to that at some point.